Hello everybody, welcome you back to another reading of the Grand Design Exposed, and today we're going to be covering two chapters in the book written by John Daniel, and that's going to be chapter 5 and chapter 6. And chapter 5 is called Rome's Counter-Reformation and the Jesuits, and in the previous chapter we talked about Martin Luther and how he was basically the forefather of the Reformation. Went into some good detail about Martin Luther, and now we're going to be looking at the Counter-Reformation and the Jesuit order. And this is really when the book really starts to take off into some very unique and interesting history. So probably a lot of history that you may have never heard of before. So let's go ahead and get started. This is chapter 5, Rome's Counter-Reformation and the Jesuits. Rome in trouble. The beast was wounded, and is struck out in every direction, but the seeds of Protestantism spread like a prairie fire all over Europe. It could not be contained. Rome was in deep trouble, a serious crisis unlike any before. What to do, what to do? To Rome, there was only one answer: more force, more brute force, to make all comply, so the Inquisition was revitalized. The minds of the people had been opened to great understanding, and in face of the most fiercest and savage oppressions, to the cruelest tortures and the most horrible of deaths, they fearlessly met them all for the sake of truth, to breathe liberty, to live a life free from Rome's corruption, and bondage was valued greater than life itself. America has always been hailed as the nation which offered refuge and a haven for liberty and freedom for those who were persecuted and oppressed. It was the land of the free and home of the brave, where liberty and freedom rings. Over and over, this American virtue was brought to our attention so as to contrast it with other nations, and rightly so. But have you ever considered this? If people were seeking liberty and freedom, they must have been fleeing a land that prohibited it. And so a very sober and profound question must be asked. Who and what were they running away from? If you know history, especially church history, then you know what the answer is. Most today cannot give the correct answer, and there is a reason for that. Obviously, so that the answer becomes vague and confused in our minds. No longer is the history of the Reformation taught, or the Inquisition explained, or the battle name Protestants used. Nor is it explained today that because Roman Catholics are taught and believe that their allegiance is first to Rome, instead to the country where they live, they were during the colony years of this nation, forbidden to hold public offices, what is gained by clouding these issues. So let me repeat this. Obviously, so that the answer becomes vague and confused in our minds, no longer is the history of the Reformation taught, or the Inquisition explained, or the battle name Protestants used. Nor is it explained today that because Roman Catholics are taught and believe that their allegiance is first to Rome instead to the country where they live, they were during the colony years of this nation forbidden to hold public office. That's something to consider here. Okay? When it comes to devout Roman Catholics, their allegiance is first and foremost to Rome before their homeland that they're from. And during the beginning stages of the colonial period and these types of things, it was forbidden for a Roman Catholic priest to hold public worship or hold public offices in this land, because they already had the colonies already had freedom. They were free from the persecutions. They left the persecutions of Rome and they fled to this land. So why would they need freedom? Was it somebody else that needed freedom? This is something we're going to be getting into in this book. What is gained by clouding these issues? It is simply this. Because this history, these terms, this fearsome struggle that was won at such an awesome price must be erased from our thinking. We must now be led to believe that Rome has changed, that her past has actually been maligned, and that she is really good, innocent, and benevolent. Rome was shaken terribly by the advances of the Protestant Reformation and vigorously entered into a counter-offensive, what history records as the Counter-Reformation. But with the resurgence of sheer force, Rome fully underestimated those who had been enlightened, who had tasted the freedom of conscience and the true worship of Christ, who could no longer accept Rome's absurdities or be forced by her brutalities as a means to exploit them. And so Rome, after many horrifying years, finally came to realize if the wound was to be healed, she must change her tactics. It became expedient then, in order to gain confidence and win the world back into her fold, she must alter her course. She needed to implement a very different stratagem. Marvelous in her shrewdness and cunning as is the Roman Church, it is a part of Rome's policy to assume the character which will best accomplish her purpose. But beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, she conceals the deadly venom of the viper. Jesuits founded. Martin Luther was excommunicated in 1521. In 1540, a former military man named Ignatius Loyola, mortified by the advances of Protestantism, resurrected the original Templar ideal of the warrior monk, the soldier of Christ, and created his own such soldiery. So this was a military order. It was a military order on its founding. It's a military order today. It's a different type of military order. They don't use physical weapons and tanks and guns and these types of things. I don't even know, it's not above them to do these things, but for the most part, their primary weapon of war is a war against the mind. It's a psychic warfare type strategy. Unlike the Templars, however, Loyola's soldiery would crusade not with the sword, as I just stated, though perfectly prepared to let others wield it on their behalf, but with the word. Thus was born what Loyola called the Company of Jesus, until the Pope, recoiling from the explicit military connotations of company, insisted it be changed to society. In their martial structure and organization, and their far-flung network of provinces, in their rigid discipline, the Jesuits were, by Loyola's own admission, modeled on the Templars. Indeed, they often acted as military advisors and ordnance experts, as well as high-level diplomats and ambassadors. Like the Templars, the Jesuits were nominally subject only to the Church. But like the Templars, the Jesuit order is an absolute monarchy. Their general, who they affectionately call, quote-unquote, the Black Pope, because of his black robe, rules for life. The pattern of their own order has molded their thinking about all other political structures, including the Vatican. The Jesuits are different. Every Catholic priest knows this. They are so different in their priestly deportment and social conduct that other priests feel ill at ease and uncomfortable in their presence. Lay people also think that Jesuits are different. They speak of the Society of Jesus as the educated clergy, the teaching arm of the church. They have the most schools, which is true. The Jesuits write the most books, which is also true. In fact, it is said that any Jesuit who can pen one word after another seems forced, under obedience, to write a book. And in return, mountains of books have been written about the Jesuits. However, there can be no denying the fact that the Jesuits possess a hard core of extremely intelligent, intensely loyal, politically shrewd, carefully calculating individuals. This has been so since the days of their founder, Ignatius of Loyola began leading his fellow students into his peculiar methods of indoctrination, the spiritual exercises. Strict, unconditional obedience and submission to one's superior is incontestable, the first in the summary of Jesuit order rules. So, that's the primary mindset of the Jesuit, is strict obedience. Tunnel vision. They only have one mind, and that mind is to be obedient to the superior general, and that's it. They don't care if it hurts another member of the society. That it doesn't matter in that regard. It doesn't matter if it hurts somebody outside the society. As long as they're obedient to the superior general, then that's their mission. It's strict obedience. As a corpse, basically. So strict unconditional obedience and submission to one's superior is incontestable, the first in the summary of Jesuit order rules. Not the same as regular military obedience, which controls only exterior acts, but it requires the sacrifice of the will and laying aside of one's own judgment. Besides, amongst the Jesuits, not only the will, but also reasoning and even moral scruples must be sacrificed to the first virtue of obedience, which is the strongest rampart of their society. The Jesuits must be in the hands of their superiors as a corpse in the undertaker's hands, as a staff obeying every impulse, as a ball of wax which can be shaped and stretched in any direction. Loyola wrote, "Let us be convinced that all is well and right when the superior commands it, and we must see black as white if the church says so." Unquote. The Jesuit must be totally subjected to his masters. Any doubt or any scruple would be imputed to him as sin, and something even better. The Jesuit must see in his superior not a fallible man, but Christ himself. Here is a proven fact in their quote-unquote constitutions. It is repeated 500 times that one must see Christ in the person of their general. Thus, with 14 years of this intense brand of education, the Jesuit is prepared as the strike force for the Roman Church. So that's basically how long the schooling and the training takes for one to become a Jesuit, is 14 years. 14 years of schooling. The spiritual exercises become the intuition or the initiation which begins the development of the Jesuit recruits. From the very beginning, they are carried off into occult hallucinatory mysticism. It is not needed to explain to any student of Scripture what spirit this mysticism comes from. Religious mystics normally interpret their ecstasy or trances in terms of real contact with God, preceded by intense meditation and profound concentration, with the aid of a quote-unquote director. The individual becomes oblivious to the world of external reality and enters into an altered state of consciousness. The sincere mystic, while in this state, may experience deep emotional revelations or intellectual adventures of great significance to him. When produced by more emotionally and demanding techniques such as Loyola's spiritual exercises, the effects become more permanent. The candidate's sensitiveness becomes impregnated with these spiritual forces, whose persistence in his memory, and even more so in his subconscious, will be as strong years later as at the beginning. They coming up to the surface and being unable to oppose, he will have to follow their irresistible impulses. It is understandable that after 4 weeks devoted to these intensive exercises with a director as his only companion, the candidate would be ripe for his subsequent training in discipline and subordination. So we see this meditation, this going into an altered state of consciousness. And now when you go back to the whole thing when we talked about the rapture and futurism, now I want you to really think about the whole McDonald vision regarding the rapture, and just think about that in my other series that I'm working on. If you've been following along in that Spirit of Prophecy series. Section 3, Council of Trent. To stem the increasing tide of the advancing work of the Reformation, 3 main efforts were employed by Rome as it embarked on its Counter-Reformation. These were the Inquisition, the newly authorized Jesuit order, and the calling of a church council, which was held in Trent, Italy. Pope Paul III, on June 21st, 1542, issued his proclamation announcing the establishment of the Inquisition in Rome as a central authority for all countries committed to the struggle against those who were accused of heresy. You can substitute that word heresy for fundamentalism, or fundamentalist, or extremist, or terrorist today. The call for a new council was voiced increasingly by both secular and ecclesiastical dignitaries, while in Rome the Papal Inquisition began its work. After several setbacks, the Council of Trent began its deliberations in 1545. The council was in session on and off for 18 years until 1563, although the actual working time was only about 4.5 years. You know, if they would have basically, in a nutshell, in other words, if this would have been an everyday meeting at this council, it would have taken 4.5 years to do. But they branched it off here and there, here a little, there a little. The excommunication and condemnation of Martin Luther and his teachings 25 years earlier failed utterly to have its desired effect. Since 1520, Paul III's entire Catholic world had been falling down around his ears, where nearly half of Europe had turned away from the one holy Catholic Church. The Protestant revolt in Germany and England had rapidly eaten its way into France, Holland, Belgium, Austria, Switzerland, and Czechoslovakia, and had infected every other country. It had shattered the once universally accepted papal authority, successfully attacked basic Catholic notions about priesthood, Eucharist, sacraments, grace, episcopal office, emptied thousands of convents and monasteries, liquidated the unity of Catholic belief, converted whole nations to the new faith, and inspired both political and military alliances aimed at the physical destruction of Pope Paul III's papacy. There was a great and urgent need for the Council of Trent, and that Rome was foundering terribly. And the success of that council ranks as one of the most important in the history of Catholicism. Its great priorities were to state Catholic doctrine in view of the Protestant position, to fully reassert her authority among dissenting factions, and give the appearance of reforms were needed. The career of the new Jesuit order was launched when Pope Paul III chose them to represent him in the capacity of pontifical theologians, quote unquote. Pope Paul III was not disappointed in its choice in employing the Jesuits to become the champions of Catholic unity. And they're the champions of Catholic unity today. Nothing's changed. The Jesuits Lainez and Salmeron entered upon their work of the Council of Trent with so much promptitude and great zeal that they won for their order the confidence of the popes and church for all time. Working untiringly, and with much cunning and clever maneuvers, they succeeded in defeating the opposition and all heretic claims, especially any reform of the papacy. Lainez himself, by a forceful counterattack, upheld pontifical infallibility, asserting that Catholic unity can be assured only through an effective submission to Christ's vicar, the Pope. The Holy See emerged from the Council of Trent, strengthened from the crisis where it nearly foundered, as a result of the steadfast actions of the Jesuits. The Holy See recognized the strength and power this new order would bring to the Church. The so-called reforms of the Roman Church during the Council of Trent were emphatically not changes or reforms in her false doctrines. Theological topics, according to Scripture, were put aside. Instead, it was internal reforms that strengthened and consolidated the discipline of the priests, the monitoring of heretics, the need for dioceses to be visited regularly and reported on, the authorization procedure for publications of books, especially the Bible, the legal powers of the bishops, the supervision of education in the schools, among many other issues, so that direct control could be tightened and the well-being of the Church ensured. Above all was the Council's definition of heresy made paramount, with new ways for combating it devised. So basically what started off as a mortal wound, basically at the protest of Luther, it didn't take much longer than 23 years before an order was founded and the strength resumed. It was just basically a scratch. It wasn't really a mortal wound. Chapter 6, Society of Jesus Order, a look at Ignatius Loyola. Early life. It is utterly amazing the arrogant and obstinate confidence which is imbued in a person's mind when born of the noble and aristocratic class, born in a castle, to live in a king's court, to see, feel, and fully understand everything that is royalty, is an experience that most of us will never have. Yet this was the heritage of Inigo Lopez de Loyola, destined to be founder of that order of priests who was to agitate the whole world. Inigo de Loyola was born in 1491, the youngest of 5 sisters and 8 brothers. His mother died when he was a small infant. 1 year after his birth, Christopher Columbus electrified Spaniards and all Europeans alike with his mind-boggling news of the discovery of the New World. When Columbus sailed off on his second voyage to this marvelous New World in 1493, one of Inigo's brothers equipped a vessel and joined the fleet, sailed off with him. At age 16, about the time his father, Don Beltram, died, he was made a page boy at the royal summer residence, spending the next 10 years of his life in the pomp and formalism of court life and aristocratic ways. Also about this time, Queen Isabella died. King Ferdinand of Spain, now 52, remarried Germaine de Foix, a 15-year-old French princess, and Inigo, the page, was assigned to serve the new Spanish queen. In Inigo's mind, to serve was to love was to serve. Inigo's first love was Germaine de Foix. Inigo never grew taller than 5 foot 1 inches. Whether his small stature gave him a complex even to sometimes fantasizing can never be known, but descriptions given seems he struggled to find his place in life. He was one who wanted to excel, never satisfied with second best. He was bold, defiant, cunning, violent, vindictive, with an unbendable iron will. This report, given from a police record after excesses, serious and grave misdemeanors, who along with his clergyman brother was brought to justice. In 1517, at age 26, and desirous of finding glory, he entered the military service. 4 years later, a cannon shot passed between his legs, shattering his right leg and damaged his other. Thus ended Inigo's short military career. The mangled leg, being hurriedly and clumsily set, was also jolted in the grueling stretcher journey over the hills to Inigo's castle home. It had to be reset twice in hopes of straightening it, with further added agony of having a protruding lump of bone sawed off. A surgical rack where he had to lay motionless for weeks to stretch the leg to its normal length, but without success left him with a permanent limp. All this was done without anesthetic, with Inigo almost dying from the ordeal. A pretty rough little go there, definitely, for sure. You can't take anything away from that. This experience became the pivotal point in Inigo's life as his thoughts turned to spiritual things. During Inigo's long convalescence of agony and many sleepless nights, he occupied much of his idle time by reading his sister-in-law's books of devotion, a monkish, quote, Life of Christ, unquote, and, quote unquote, the Golden Legend, Lives of the Saints, writing so laden with myth and miracles that the transition from reality to fantasy was an easy one. Buffeted by depression now, exalted by free-flowing happiness then, suddenly afflicted with growing doubts about God. His sanity, the need to be a success about everything, this seesaw, wavering state of mind, made him receptive to his so-called miraculous vision of the Virgin and Child. And so basically, with all of these tribulations that Loyola was going through, he now turned to spiritual things, spiritualism. Okay? And then he started reading all these books of devotions and these types of things. And all these books were like based off of mythical miracles. And out of these mythical miracles, now we have these miraculous visions of the Virgin and Child. Okay? Because this isn't the spiritual truth of Scripture. No. This is all grounded and rooted in mystics and mysticism, which in turn is where these visions of the Virgin and Child comes from. It's not Christianity. So moving on, it was during this period that he claims to have made a vow of perpetual loyalty and chastity. Instead of a glorious military career, he will now be a warrior in a different sense, a soldier for Christ. As a young man driven with inner turmoils, he turned to the only place he knew for spiritual answers, his Roman Catholic Church. So he didn't go to the Bible. He didn't go to God in prayer. He went to the Pope. He went to the Roman Catholic Church. 3 more years were spent in this battle, raging within himself, spending enormous lengths confessing his sins, a vigil before the shrine of Our Lady, dressed in rough pilgrim's garb, and dividing his time between a cave on a riverbank and a cell in the Dominican religious house. These savage austerities permanently undermined his health. In his search, he talked with his confessor and visited the hermit monks who lived in the caves about the monastery. Gaunt, ragged, matted hair, with wild eyes and begging bowel, in the depths of self-mortification, doubting his salvation, never finding the peace of Christ. His wild asceticism took him to the brink of suicidal despair. It was here, it is believed, that Inigo, during this fragile state of mind, was introduced to the original Benedictine spiritual exercises. They became indelibly etched on his mind. It was out of this trial, self-examination, and anguish, yearning for peace and light, that emerged a new man, one who wanted to leave the old behind. Inigo was displaced by Ignatius, a name adopted in memory of an early Christian martyr. The process was agonizing, but with his mind in its fluctuating state, practicing contemplation and meditation, he achieved that marvelous experience of hallucinatory ecstasy, that overwhelming deception of Satan. Believing it was of God, Ignatius had discovered the secret of Roman Catholic mysticism. With this delusion, he began to fashion his mysterious and most prized tool, his own little book of spiritual exercises. Like a compulsion in all good Catholics, Ignatius made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Upon returning to Europe, he had fully decided to become a priest. To make this decision a reality, he realized that he lacked a vital and necessary ingredient, a formal education, which was a formal education. At 33, he plunged into 10 years of classrooms, the hardest and longest phase of his bizarre development. As for what specific purpose, it yet was not clear to him. Ever molding his spiritual exercises, he was anxious to experiment with them on willing fellow students. As a result, on several occasions, Ignatius came under the scrutiny of the Inquisition. It was reported that members of the group that had formed around him had been seen groveling in convulsions of repentance, fainting away in ecstasy, howling as evil spirits were exorcised. Does that sound very, very familiar to what we see in some of these Pentecostal churches today? Well, let me just repeat this. It was reported that members of the group that had formed around him had been seen groveling in convulsions of repentance, fainting away in ecstasy, howling as evil spirits were exorcised. Rumors heightened the scandal, when females were also said to have been involved. With some prison time closely questioned but cleared, he was ordered to stop teaching. He was ordered to stop teaching in public and in private on pain of excommunication. Instead, by 1540, when Ignatius had put the spiritual exercises into its final shape, his zeal to excel in glorifying God and saving one's soul, the exercises became his supreme method for binding his disciples in obedience to his cause. Pope's men approved. Through those years in school, to acquire his education, Ignatius made believers who became his steadfast followers. Thoughts, ideas, and plans were formulated into a firm and real goal. Ignatius became a priest in 1537. The rapid advancement of the Protestant movement was causing a great alarm, making it clear that the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church was in mortal trouble. What was needed was a different weapon to fight this totally new warfare. a new order of priests to become a special group of quote-unquote Pope's men. The Pope's men, his soldiers, to take a special vow of absolute obedience directly to the Pope, to go anywhere, at any time, at any cost to life and comfort in order to do anything the Pope deemed necessary for the defense and propagation of the faith. In other words, for the greater glory of God. The Church to rule the world, the Pope to rule the Church, the Jesuits to rule the Pope, such was and is the program of the Order of Jesus. On September 27th, 1540, in a private reception hall of the Palace of the Popes on Vatican Hill, Rome, 11 men of aristocratic birth met with Pope Paul III, who gave approval of their order. That beginning was so become the most loyal and most efficient organization the Roman Catholic Church has ever spawned in all its near 2,000-year history. In the agreement to rescue Rome from the predicament of losing its world control to Protestantism, and to preserve the spiritual and temporal supremacy which the popes usurped during the Middle Ages, Rome now sold the Church to the Society of Jesus. In essence, the popes surrendered themselves into their hands. So now the Church becomes immensely dependent on the Jesuit order to defend the Pope's position as the supreme spiritual and temporal leader of the world, a belief that is absolutely vital if Rome is ever to regain control of the world. So in other words, basically what the papacy did was they gave the Jesuit order absolute authority, as long, and what this was basically to restore what was lost during the Protestant Reformation. And they were given absolute authority. And in turn, the Jesuit order is dependent on the popes for exorbitant privileges and latitude, if it is to actually convince the world of its need for the Pope as its leader. It is similar to the queen bee, which lays and cultivates her eggs. Eggs, some turned into worker bees and others drone bees, one bringing her food to sustain her life, the other impregnating her, that she may continue laying fertile eggs, bound in this way as the interests of both parties become life and death issues. To separate them would fatally bring each to their end. Popes during the Middle Ages were not in any sense men who had inclinations to set examples for morality. First and foremost, they all came from enormously wealthy backgrounds, aristocratic warlords determined through the most disgusting corruptions, bribery, and bloodshed to have that ultra-coveted position. To be pope was to gain absolute power and wealth beyond the scope of any other means. Extravagant luxuries, pomp, and excesses, even surpassing that of the emperor's table, excited the lusts and passions of these aristocratic families to a fever pitch. Vast riches were paid to rivaling parties to buy them out or to cast a favorable vote. Unsuccessful attempts usually led to assassinations, orgies, incest, homosexuals, mistresses, rape, murder, plunder, and some of the most shameful scandals known to man are all recorded as the everyday rottenest lifestyle of these so-called saintly religious rulers. Rome was virtually a moral cesspool of corruption, proving graphically that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Regardless of the opinions of sanctimonious apologetics, this is the red, raw meat of papal history. Conti, Savelli, Borgia, and Medici being names of some of these infamous aristocratic warring families. When Ignatius Loyola and his 10 aristocratic noblemen approached Pope Paul III, the petticoat cardinal, They all knew what was at stake in preserving their obnoxious system of authority. How could these despotic rulers even imagine submitting to a reform movement that would bring an end to their sensual luxuries and cause a social change? False religion, superstition, and brute tyranny since the dawn of man has always been used to subject the masses of human beings. Once one ascends to that exotic and intoxicating realm to rule with authority over others, to relinquish that power would be considered plain folly and absurd. Ignatius and his followers certainly were not concerned about preserving Christ-taught truths or easing the lives of the poor, but instead to provide an effective means to halt encroachment on their treasured and haughty lifestyles exacted by such terrible expense and misery of all those subjected under them. The pronouncement of Pope Paul III's blessings upon Ignatius Loyola and his Society of Jesus Order was as if a magic wand had been waved over them. Like the Knights Templar, Ignatius had asked for and received that his order not be responsible or need to report to anyone with the exception of the Pope himself. Complete autonomy was insisted upon as expedient for freedom of movement and actions. It cannot be stressed enough that Ignatius and his men were aristocrats. This in itself wielded extraordinary power and influence, not just with the upper class, but to move, work, to be recognized and feel comfortable, even in the presence of kings and queens, is a status that is known only to a privileged few. But add to this the heady prestige of the Pope's blessing and law, and you have a potential of power and influence that exceeded the very kings themselves. Bear in mind that histories which describe the Jesuits make it vividly clear that the first point of business when they became an order was to go back into their circle of aristocrats and royalty so as to gain their confidence and support. To give you an idea of the support they received, their membership went from the original 11 men in 1540 to 5,000 by 1581. And in another 35 years, by 1615, it had jumped to more than 13,000. Jesuits worked all over Europe, in some African countries, and in the Middle East. They expanded to the Philippines, Indonesia, and Indochina. They had extensive missions in Canada, Paraguay, and Japan. Overall, by 1581, they had 370 schools and colleges, 33 provinces, 120 Jesuit residences, and 550 communities. Do you think they gained their support of the royal elite? I do believe so. For greater glory of God. Ignatius coined the phrase for the greater glory of God. Hermann Bersamlam of Cologne was the Jesuit that taught the end justifies the means. When you analyze the subtlety of these two concepts, if a person believes utmost in his mind that what he is doing is for the greater glory of God, and when that work is placed above everything else on earth, then the next step becomes easy when rationalizing. Use whatever means necessary to accomplish that end. It is interesting that in many dictionaries for the word Jesuit, they give as a secondary definition crafty person, intriguer, sophist, and the adjective Jesuitical is synonymous with cunning or deceitful. That's the adjective definition of the term. And their self-righteous zeal for the Jesuit to bring the world into submission to Rome, morality never governs their code of ethics. They have their own brand of principles. Jesuits, when appearing as members of their order, wore a garb of sanctity, visiting prisons and hospitals, ministering to the sick and poor, professing to have renounced the world, and bearing the sacred name of Jesus who went about doing good. But under this blameless exterior, the most criminal and deadly purpose were often concealed, motivated by that fundamental principle of their order, that the end justifies the means. By this code, lying, theft, perjury, assassinations were not only pardonable, but commendable when they served the interests of the church. We see a lot of that today, don't we? This outward expression from Roman Catholicism with all these hospitals and missionaries to prisons and homeless and these types of things. But that's just only what they give you to see out in the open. But what are they really? What's going on behind the scenes? Because what they're doing out in the public is nothing but a front. It's a lie, is what it is. Cut off from early ties and human interests, dead to the claims of natural affection, reason and conscience wholly silenced, Jesuits knew no rule, no tie but that of their order, and no duty but to extend its power for the Pope. There was no crime too great for them to commit, no deception too base for them to practice, no disguise too difficult for them to assume. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, to be used in the designed overthrow of Protestantism and the re-establishment of Roman Catholic supremacy. Confessors, state of the art. Picture this, if you will. You have a group of aristocratic men of influence who have been endowed with the highest religious authority on earth. Their purpose is to re-enter the royal circle and energize its members by teaching, education, and persuasion. This is basically how the deception come through to what we have today, is through teaching, education, and persuasion. Those three things. But by force if necessary, prodding them to the conformity of Rome. These men also perfect a requirement that literally becomes awesome in its effectiveness and scope to accomplish their goal. Above all things, Jesuits are confessors. Their service unto the royalty was urged as a need, as they became assigned to hear the confessions of the aristocrats, emperors, kings, queens, princes, princesses, mistresses, those in every level of government. They all revealed their secret plans, their intimate sins, their innermost thoughts. As their lives became virtually an open book to the Jesuits, as an intelligence gathering system of espionage, none greater has ever been devised and developed in the world as compared to the auricular confessions employed by the Jesuits. It was only after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 that began the requirement for all Catholics to go to confession at least once a year. But it is to the Jesuits who are credited with inventing the box confessional as a means of popularizing a duty which until then had been for most Catholics a twice-yearly occurrence at most. But now it's considered a duty. And this is how they gathered intelligence, by having all these emperors, kings, queens, princes, and all these high royal officials going to confession, confessing their secrets to these priests, these Jesuit priests. And hence this was their information gathering, was these confessional boxes. It was done in these box confessionals. Now, thanks to the Society of Jesus, sins are atoned for more speedily. People having scarcely committed a sin before they confess it, some Catholics being shocked by this development as they are urged to go monthly or even weekly for confession. By the end of the 16th century, the Jesuit general congregation in Rome, with delegates coming from all the Jesuit provinces, had taken on the character of political intelligence meetings so as to consider what was good and directing the conscience of rulers. So who's behind the directing the consciences of rulers? It just says it right here. There ain't no new thing under the sun, so isn't it still the same today? I do believe so. Through various means of diplomacy, Jesuits worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings and shaping the policy of nations. But it was religion and its sacred duties of hearing the confessions of their penitents and being their religious wise guides that was the key to their success. Without the need of a religious confessor, the history of the Jesuits may have been quite different, and the Jesuits made very sure that it was they who filled that need as confessors, instead of the other order of priests, by providing a most attractive policy of leniency as an enticement for their penitents. Thus, we're going to conclude our reading for this video, as chapters 5 and 6 dealt exclusively with the Jesuit order and the founder, one of the main founders of the Jesuit order, Ignatius de Loyola, and what they are really about. And in chapter 7, which is titled English History and American Heritage, this is where it's going to get really interesting, because now we're going to see, because we just got an overview of what the Jesuit order does in regards to being in positions of power, to attract confessions from these emperors, kings, queens, princes, princesses, and mistresses, and these types of things. In a box confessional, they confess their deepest desires and secrets to these priests, and that's how they gathered their intelligence. And now we're going to see the workings of these intelligence within the next coming chapters. And starting in chapter 7, which is titled English History, American Heritage. Again, which is some very interesting history, probably some history that you probably haven't even heard of yet. So, I'd like to thank you for staying with me on this. Truth be told, truth be known. Stay safe. God bless. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.